Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. You know we love to go deep on the topics you all suggest, and today we're going to be diving into emotions.
Yeah, emotions. It's a topic that I find really fascinating from both the practical side of things, how can we actually manage our emotions better, but also from a scientific perspective, like what's actually going on in our brains when we experience all these different feelings.
I'm so glad we're talking about this because I've been reading Master Your Emotions by Thibaut Meurisse, and it's got me thinking a lot about this stuff.
That's a great book. We
Oh.
can definitely dig into that today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you sent me some of that research from Richard J. Davidson, the neuroscientist.
Right, right. Yeah, he's done some really groundbreaking work on the neuroscience of emotions.
Yeah. That stuff blew my mind. And I've even got some of my own personal notes on the topic, so we've got like a triple whammy of resources to draw from.
Awesome. Yeah, I think what makes this deep dive really unique is that we're combining like practical self-help advice with actual scientific research.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me with Mieris's book. He's not just saying think positive or whatever. He's actually explaining the why behind it.
Exactly. And I think that understanding can be really empowering
Hmm.
because if we know how our emotions work on a deeper level,
Yeah,
then we can start to make real changes in our lives.
absolutely. Like, for example, Mieris has this really interesting idea that our emotions aren't necessarily dictated by what happens to us, but by how we interpret what happens.
Mhm.
And he uses this vivid analogy of a slaughterhouse.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one. So imagine like walking into a slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
Okay, one person might be horrified by that scene,
Mhm.
the blood, the smells, the whole atmosphere.
Yeah, totally.
But then another person, say the business owner,
Right.
they might feel a sense of pride in their work,
Mm.
you know, like they're providing food for people, they're running a successful business. It's the same event, the same objective reality.
Yeah, but totally different emotional responses.
Exactly.
Mm.
So what's going on there? Why do we interpret things so differently?
Okay, so that's where I think Davidson's research comes in. He talks about something called emotional style, which is like a unique recipe for how each person experiences and reacts to the world.
Oh, I like that analogy, the recipe. It's like we each have our own unique blend of ingredients that determine how we respond emotionally.
Right. And he actually breaks down this recipe into 6 different dimensions. Things like resilience, outlook, social intuition, self-awareness, context sensitivity, and attention.
And the fascinating thing is that these differences in emotional style actually show up in the way our brains are wired.
Wait, really? So like our brains are physically different depending on our emotional style.
Yeah, well, not entirely different, but there are measurable differences in brain structure and activity that correlate with these different emotional dimensions.
That's wild. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's take resilience.
Yeah.
Davidson's research has shown that people who are more resilient actually have more white matter highways connecting their amygdala,
Okay.
which is the part of the brain that processes fear and other strong emotions,
Right, the fear center.
to their prefrontal cortex, which
Mhm.
is responsible for planning and decision-making. So it's like their brains are better at regulating those intense emotions.
Oh, so like the resilient people, their brains are better at like putting the brakes on when things get too intense?
Exactly. It's almost like they have a built-in cooling system for their emotional responses, which allows them to bounce back more quickly from tough situations.
Wow. So it's not just like they're mentally stronger or whatever. Their brains are actually wired differently to help them cope with stress.
Exactly. And I think this ties in nicely with one of Mieris's central points, that we have more control over our emotions than we might think.
Okay. But if our brains are wired a certain way,
Yeah.
like how much control can we actually have? It seems like we're sort of stuck with the emotional hardware we're born with.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of leads us into Meuriss's concept of the ego. Now, he describes the ego as this sort of survival mechanism, right? Something that was really useful back in the caveman days when we were dodging saber-toothed tigers and stuff.
Okay, so like our ancestors needed that fight or flight response to stay alive.
Exactly. But Meurisse argues that in modern times, this ego can actually work against our happiness.
Interesting. Okay, so how does that work? How does the ego like get in the way of our happiness these days?
Well, he says that the ego thrives on external validation and comparison. You know, it's always looking for ways to prove its worth.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that can lead to a lot of negative emotions like jealousy, insecurity, and this constant need to be right.
So it's like our ego is stuck in this prehistoric mode, constantly scanning for threats.
Right.
Even though the threats are mostly imaginary these days.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're not really worried about being eaten by a lion anymore.
Yeah, well, most of us aren't anyway.
Right. But our ego is still operating as if we are. And that can create a lot of unnecessary stress and suffering.
Okay, so if the ego is so powerful, how do we even begin to manage it? Where do we start?
Well, both Meurisse and Davidson offer some really practical tools for managing those ego-driven thoughts and emotions.
Okay, good, because I was going to say this is all very interesting, but I need some actionable advice here.
We'll definitely get to that. But before we do, I think it's important to emphasize one point that really stood out to me in your personal notes.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
You had written about the importance of self-awareness.
Oh, yeah, totally. I think self-awareness is like the foundation for everything else we're talking about.
Exactly. Like, if we don't understand our own emotional patterns, it's hard to make any real changes, you know?
Yeah, it's like trying to navigate a city without a map.
Right. Self-awareness gives us that map of our own inner world.
Yeah.
It allows us to see our triggers, our habitual thought patterns, the things that tend to push our buttons.
And once we have that map, then we can start to find new routes, new ways of responding to those triggers.
Exactly. So, in terms of practical tools, Meurisse offers a whole toolbox of techniques for shifting our emotional state. And one that I've found particularly helpful is the idea of controlling our inner dialogue.
Okay. Yeah, he talks a lot about that.
Yeah. He emphasizes the importance of catching those negative, self-defeating thoughts and replacing them with more positive, empowering ones.
Yeah, he calls those negative thoughts below-the-line thinking, like blaming, complaining, making excuses.
Right. And he encourages us to shift to above-the-line thinking, which is about taking responsibility, focusing on solutions, and looking for the good in every situation.
And he says it's a really subtle shift, but it can have a profound impact on our overall well-being. And you know what's really cool is that this ties in with Davidson's research on neuroplasticity,
Oh, absolutely.
the idea that our brains can actually change and rewire themselves throughout our lives.
That's right. Our brains are not static. They're constantly adapting and evolving based on our experiences and our thoughts.
So we're not just stuck with those negative thought patterns.
No.
Yeah.
We can actually train our brains to think differently.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. Like mental training, such as mindfulness meditation, has been shown to physically change the structure and function of the brain.
So like even just thinking differently can change our brains.
It can. I mean, think about it. Davidson found that even the simple act of imagining playing the piano
Wow.
can expand the region of the brain devoted to finger movements.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So our thoughts really do have the power to shape our reality.
Exactly. Which is why Meurisse places so much emphasis on choosing our inputs wisely.
Yeah, he talks a lot about limiting social media, right?
He does. Because it can be such a breeding ground for comparison and negativity.
Oh, I totally get that. I know I've definitely fallen into that trap of comparing myself to others online and feeling like I'm not good enough.
It's so easy to do, especially in today's hyper-connected world.
Yeah, for sure.
But Meurisse encourages us to be more mindful of the information we're consuming and to focus on feeding our minds with things that uplift and inspire us.
So it's not just about changing our thoughts, it's about changing our environment as well.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
about creating a space, both internal and external, that supports our emotional well-being.
Okay, so like what are some examples of that? Like how do we create that supportive environment?
Well, it can be really simple things, actually. Meurisse even talks about the importance of having a tidy desk.
Oh, really? Okay, now that's something I can get behind.
Right. He says that clutter can actually contribute to feeling overwhelmed and stressed,
Makes sense.
while a clean and organized workspace can improve focus and motivation.
I definitely feel that. When my desk is a mess, my mind feels like a mess too.
Exactly. So it's about being mindful of those little things that can impact our emotional state and making choices that support our well-being.
Okay, so that's helpful. But sometimes even with a clean desk and positive affirmations, those negative emotions can still creep in.
They do.
What about those times when we're feeling really overwhelmed, like we're just spiraling down?
Well, remember Davidson's research on the emotional style recipe. One of the key ingredients is self-awareness. And the more aware we are of our emotional patterns, the better equipped we are to deal with those challenging moments.
So it's about noticing when we're starting to spiral and then having some tools to help us shift out of that negative state?
Precisely. Meurisse offers a number of techniques for managing those intense emotions. One that he borrows from Esther and Jerry Hicks is called the emotional ladder.
Oh, I remember you mentioning that earlier. Can you explain how it works?
Sure. The basic idea is that emotions can be visualized on a scale, with the most negative emotions like despair and grief at the bottom, and the most positive emotions like joy and love at the top.
Okay, so like climbing a ladder, gradually moving from a lower to a higher emotional state.
Exactly. And the key is to recognize where you are on the ladder in any given moment,
Oh,
and then identify the next step up. So if you're feeling depressed, for example, anger might actually be a step up.
wait, really?
Yeah, because it has more energy and forward momentum.
So sometimes it's about allowing ourselves to feel those negative emotions,
Right.
but then using that energy to move towards something more positive.
Exactly. And there are a number of techniques that can help us make that shift. Things like journaling, gratitude exercises, even creating music playlists tailored to specific emotional states.
Okay, those are some really practical tools, but what about those deeper, more persistent emotional challenges like depression or anxiety?
Yeah, those are really important to address, and Meurisse does talk about those as well. He emphasizes that conditions like depression aren't a sign of weakness,
Okay.
and that they often stem from negative thought patterns and limiting beliefs that we've internalized over time.
So it's not just about changing our thoughts in the moment. It's
Right.
about addressing those deeper underlying beliefs.
Exactly. It's about challenging those assumptions and creating a new, more empowering story for ourselves. And Meurisse offers a number of techniques for doing this, like cognitive reframing, which involves identifying and challenging those negative thoughts,
Yep.
and affirmations, which are positive statements that we can repeat to ourselves to help reprogram our subconscious mind.
Those are great tools. And, I think it's important to emphasize that Maurice himself has struggled with depression, so he's speaking from personal experience as well as professional expertise.
Absolutely. And his message is one of hope and empowerment. He believes that we all have the capacity to heal and to create a life filled with joy and fulfillment.
That's really inspiring. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that sometimes, even with the best tools and techniques, those negative emotions can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone who's struggling to cope with those intense feelings?
Well, first and foremost, I would encourage them to seek professional help if they feel like they're not able to manage on their own.
Yeah,
There's no shame in reaching out for support.
for sure.
But in addition to that, I think it's important to remember the power of self-compassion.
What do you mean by self-compassion?
It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a good friend. It's about acknowledging that we're all human, that we all make mistakes,
Yeah,
and that it's okay to not be perfect.
I love that. It's so easy to be hard on ourselves, especially when we're feeling down.
It is.
But giving ourselves permission to be imperfect can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And remember, self-compassion is not about letting ourselves off the hook or making excuses for our behavior.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we're worthy of love and kindness, even when we're struggling.
And I think that ties back to Mearis's point about the ego. If we can learn to quiet that inner critic and cultivate a sense of self-compassion,
Yeah,
then we're much less likely to get caught up in those negative thought patterns that lead to suffering.
exactly. It's about shifting from a place of fear and judgment to a place of love and acceptance.
Yeah.
And that's really the foundation for true emotional mastery.
This has been incredibly insightful. So to recap, we've explored the idea that our emotions are shaped by our interpretations, which are influenced by our unique emotional style.
Right.
We've also discussed the power of self-awareness and a variety of practical tools for managing those intense emotions.
Yes.
And we've emphasized the importance of self-compassion, especially when we're struggling.
Absolutely. And we've also talked about the incredible capacity of the brain to change and adapt throughout our lives.
Yeah. Right. So even if we've developed certain emotional patterns or habits, we have the power to rewire our brains and create new, more positive ways of responding to the world.
Exactly. We're not stuck. We have the power to change.
This has given me so much to think about. But before we wrap up this first part, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most from what we talked about so far?
What really resonated with me was this idea that mastering our emotions isn't about suppressing them or pretending they don't exist.
Yeah.
It's about understanding them, accepting them, and learning to work with them in a way that supports our well-being.
I completely agree. And I love the reminder that this is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn and discover about ourselves and our emotional landscape.
Absolutely. And the more we learn, the more empowered we become to create a life that is truly aligned with our values and aspirations.
I love that. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the world of emotions with even more insights and practical tips. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back and ready to keep going deeper into this fascinating world of emotions.
Yeah. Where were we?
We were talking about self-awareness, like how important it is to have that map of our own emotional landscape.
Right, right. because once we know our triggers and our patterns, we can start to manage our emotions more effectively.
And you were about to tell me about some of those practical tools that Meurisse offers.
Oh, yeah. Well, he's got a whole bunch. But one that I find really helpful is this idea of controlling our inner dialogue.
Yeah, he talks about that a lot, like catching those negative thoughts before they spiral out of control.
Exactly. It's like instead of letting those thoughts just run wild in our minds,
Yeah.
we can actually step back and question them.
You mean like challenge those negative thoughts and see if they're actually true?
Exactly. Because a lot of times those negative thoughts are based on distorted thinking, like all or nothing thinking or catastrophizing.
Yeah, I know. I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes.
Oh, we all are. But the key is to start noticing those patterns and then consciously choose to think differently.
Easier said than done, right?
Well, it takes practice, for sure. But Meurisse offers some really concrete techniques like affirmations and visualization.
Okay, yeah, he talks about those.
Yeah, so affirmations are basically positive statements that we repeat to ourselves to kind of reprogram our subconscious mind.
Like, I am strong or I am capable, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it might sound a little cheesy at first,
Yeah.
but there's actually a lot of research to support the idea that repeating these affirmations can actually change our brain chemistry over time.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And what about visualization? How does that work?
Well, it's basically using the power of our imagination to create a mental picture of ourselves, achieving our goals, or experiencing the emotions that we want to feel.
So, like, if I'm feeling anxious about an upcoming presentation,
Yeah,
I could visualize myself giving the presentation confidently and feeling calm and collected.
exactly. And the more we practice visualizing that positive outcome, the more likely we are to actually achieve it in real life.
Because our brains start to believe that it's possible.
Exactly. It's like we're creating a mental blueprint for success.
I love that. Okay, so we've got affirmations and visualization. What other tools does Meurisse recommend?
Oh, he's got a whole bunch. But one that I find particularly interesting is this idea of the emotional ladder.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. Can you remind me how that works?
Sure. So the basic idea is that all of our emotions exist on a kind of spectrum, with the most negative emotions like despair and grief at the bottom, and the most positive emotions like joy and love at the top.
Okay, so it's like a ladder with different rungs representing different emotional states.
Exactly. And the key is to recognize where you are on the ladder in any given moment, and then identify the next step up.
So if I'm feeling really down, like at the bottom of the ladder,
Yeah.
the goal isn't necessarily to jump straight to joy,
Right.
but maybe just to move up one rung to a slightly less negative emotion.
Precisely. And sometimes that might mean allowing ourselves to feel those negative emotions fully without judgment so that we can process them and move through them.
That makes sense, because sometimes trying to force ourselves to be happy when we're not just makes us feel worse.
Exactly. It's like trying to put a Band-Aid over a wound without actually cleaning it out first.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So the emotional ladder is really about giving ourselves permission to feel the full range of human emotions, but also having the awareness to recognize when we're stuck in a negative state and then having the tools to help us move up the ladder.
I like that. It feels very empowering.
It is, because it reminds us that we're not victims of our emotions. We have the power to choose how we respond to them.
Okay, it's all really helpful, but what about those times when our emotions feel really overwhelming, like we're just drowning in them? What do we do then?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes, even with the best tools and techniques, our emotions can feel really intense and difficult to manage.
Yeah.
And in those moments, it's so important to be kind to ourselves, to practice self-compassion.
What do you mean by self-compassion?
Well, it's basically treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a good friend. It's about recognizing that we're all human, that we all make mistakes, that it's okay to not be perfect.
I love that, because I think it's so easy to be our own worst critics, especially when we're feeling down.
It is, but beating ourselves up just makes us feel worse.
Exactly. So how do we actually cultivate more self-compassion? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, it starts with noticing that inner critic, that voice in our heads that's constantly judging and criticizing us.
Oh, yeah, I know that voice well.
We all do. But the key is to start challenging that voice, to question its validity, and to remind ourselves that we are worthy of love and kindness, even when we mess up.
Does that mean we just let ourselves off the hook for everything?
No, not at all. Self-compassion is not about making excuses for our behavior. It's about holding ourselves accountable, but doing so from a place of love and understanding rather than judgment and shame.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like we can acknowledge that we made a mistake, but we don't have to beat ourselves up about it.
Exactly. It's about learning from our mistakes
Yeah.
and moving forward with grace and compassion.
This is making me think about something Meurisse said about how the ego is always trying to protect us.
Yeah,
But sometimes that protection can actually backfire and make us feel worse.
absolutely. Because the ego thrives on fear and separation, while self-compassion is rooted in love and connection.
So it's like by practicing self-compassion, we're actually weakening the grip of the ego.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful way to put it. Because when we're able to treat ourselves with kindness and understanding, we're less likely to get caught up in those negative thought patterns that the ego feeds on.
This has been so insightful. I'm already starting to feel a shift in my own thinking just from having this conversation.
Me too. I think it's amazing how just talking about these things can help us to become more aware and more empowered.
And I think it's important to remember that this is an ongoing process. There's no finish line when it comes to emotional mastery.
Exactly. It's a lifelong journey of self-discovery and growth. And it's a journey that's worth taking.
I completely agree. All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part. Should we take another break and then come back for the final stretch?
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into emotions.
I'm ready to wrap this up.
Me too. You know, as we're thinking about all this stuff, one thing that really sticks with me is that both Meurisse and Davidson emphasize that mastering our emotions isn't about, like, never feeling anything negative ever again.
Right. It's not about becoming some emotionless robot.
Exactly. It's more about, like, building the skills and awareness so we can navigate the full spectrum of human emotions in a healthier, more constructive way.
Yeah, it's about learning to ride the waves, so to speak, rather than getting swept away by them.
I like that analogy. And what's really exciting is that Davidson's research suggests that we're not just stuck with our default emotional settings, you know? Our brains are capable of change.
Yeah, that's the beauty of neuroplasticity.
Exactly. It means that even deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and feeling can be shifted with intentional practice.
It's like we have the power to rewire our brains for greater resilience, a more positive outlook, even better social intuition. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is, but it does kind of raise an interesting question.
Oh.
Like, if we could intentionally rewire our brains for a specific emotional style, would we even want to? You know, it's not necessarily about erasing all negative emotions, right? Sometimes those emotions serve a purpose.
That's a really good point. Like fear, for example. It
Mhm.
can protect us from danger.
Right. And anger can motivate us to make positive changes.
Mm.
Sadness can help us process loss and connect more deeply with others.
Exactly. So maybe it's not about eliminating those emotions altogether, but learning to experience them in a healthier way, you know?
I think so. Finding that balance between acceptance and action, like allowing ourselves to feel the full range of human emotions, but also having the tools and the awareness to navigate them in a way that supports our overall well-being.
I think that's the key, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not about denying or suppressing our emotions, but about learning to work with them skillfully.
And that's where all of those practical strategies we discussed come in, right?
Okay.
Things like mindfulness, gratitude, positive affirmations, reframing negative thoughts.
Exactly. All of those tools can help us to become more aware of our emotions, to understand them better, and to choose how we respond to them rather than just reacting automatically.
So it's about shifting from reaction to response.
Exactly.
Mm.
And I think the key takeaway here is that it's an ongoing process. There's no finish line when it comes to emotional mastery.
It's more like a lifelong journey of self-discovery and growth.
Yeah, and even small steps can make a big difference over time.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear what one small step our listeners can take today to start cultivating a more empowered relationship with their emotions.
That's a great question. Well, it could be anything, really, as long as it feels manageable and meaningful.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be anything huge or drastic.
Right, like maybe it's just setting aside 5 minutes for a mindful breathing exercise, or
Yeah.
noticing those below-the-line thoughts without judgment, or even just expressing gratitude to someone you care about.
I love all of those ideas. And I think the most important thing is to just choose one thing and commit to doing it consistently.
Consistency is key, for sure, because even small actions, when done consistently, can create a ripple effect in our lives.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of the science and practice of emotional mastery.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you all.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep mastering those emotions.